Kiely, a features editor at Variety, and your host for today's Half Hour With. I am so excited to introduce you to our Emmy-nominated panelists from Hulu's mega hit show, Normal People. We are so happy to have with us today director and executive producer Lenny Abrahamson, co-writer Alice Birch, actor Paul Mescal, and casting director Louise Kiely. Before we dive into our conversation, let's take a short look at a clip from the show.
Hey, it's me again. I know it's late to be calling and all that, and I know you probably don't want to talk to me or anything, but I was just calling to say that I miss you. See, I can't really talk to anybody the way that I talk to you or anything like that, and I don't really know what to say other than the fact that I miss you, and I really love you, Marianne, and I'm sorry.
I was not prepared for how emotional that was going to make me. It brought up so many feelings from that episode, which I started so angry at Connell and then ended up feeling bad for him. It is such a fantastic show, and it feels like everyone's fallen in love with it. But Lenny, just curious, if by some reason someone listening today hasn't had a chance to watch the show, what is one thing you would say about it or to them to encourage them to drop everything and watch it now?
I would say, I think, it's anchored by two amazing performances, and both Paul and Daisy, I think, captured the experience of falling in love for the first time, and with its wonderfulness and scariness and the kind of transformation that can happen or does happen to many of us at that point in life. So I think with that kind of central pair, it's a really powerful look at some really important things that all of us go through.
I'm sold. I'm going to go watch it again right now. I know this is based on the novel by Sally Rooney. I'm curious for you as a producer, what attracted you to the story and made you see it as a series? And as a director, what made you want to take on the first 6 episodes?
So I was lucky enough to, I work with Ed Guiney in Element Pictures, and Ed was sent a galley of the book, so we read it early, and he loved it and thought that I would, and I really did. And I think probably the same thing that all of us were attracted by. One is just the quality of Sally's writing. It's just beautiful and simple, and somehow makes you feel that you're in direct contact with the characters, and it's effortlessly gets inside their heads. It's really remarkable. And I think just an emotional connection to the characters and to the story made me want to be involved. And then it felt like I don't know, as a director, if there's something that I love and I can see, then I sort of just naturally want to do it. And I thought also it's a challenge because the novel is very interior and very truthful. And I just sort of felt that it resonated with me as a filmmaker, something about the directness and simplicity of Sally's style and the way I also like to work felt like a good fit. So that's kind of why I jumped on board.
And Alice, you wrote or co-wrote all but one of 12 episodes. I'm curious where you even began and what was it like diving into such a highly regarded novel?
Yeah, I mean, I was very, very lucky in that Sally Rooney is an incredibly rare thing in that she is an extraordinary novelist and a brilliant and generous collaborator and co-writer, and so that made my job pretty easy. In terms of taking on this book, I mean, that was I tend to try not to look up too much and not to worry about the audience, and just to kind of keep the conversation very much between me and Sally and Lenny, and then think about those characters. But there were days when I would be writing and then I would get on the underground and see like 3 people reading the book and suddenly feel an enormous sense of pressure. But I think you have to sort of switch off from that. And that's something that Sally does as well, incredibly graciously. It's really kind of keep focused on this story and these characters in this world.
Had you ever done an adaptation before?
I had, but of a pretty obscure Russian novella that literally nobody's reading on the tube. So it was, a different experience.
So obviously the show doesn't work without the perfect Connell and Marianne. Paul, how did you go about landing this role, and what attracted you to it? I mean, it's obvious when you see the show, but I'm wondering if it was all there on the page, or even when you get an audition notice, what you knew about this character.
So I obviously had heard about the novel. I hadn't read it at that point, but it came through like as auditions typically do. It came from Louise to my agent, and then I got sent the sides. Then I read the book between that email and essentially the first audition, and it was pretty standard in terms of how auditions go. But I think I felt a similar pressure to what Alice felt, is that the minute, from an actor's perspective, is that the minute you read those characters, you immediately fall in love with both of them, and you can see nobody but yourself in it. So, and those reactions are few and far between. Like you read scenes or you read scripts often enough, and it's rare that you feel that degree of a connection to a character. So that was kind of where I felt the pressure from.
Did you do a tape, or did you go in person?
So I was lucky. I was one of I think Louise, there was a group of actors that taped, and then there was a group of actors that went in for the first round. I was in the room with Karen and Eva Jane, who are Louise Kiely's assistants and who helped on this. So I read with them on the first tape, and then I read with Louise and Lenny for the callback.
Louise, you were tasked with casting this very specific world, and particularly these 2 leads. Can you talk about not only finding Paul, but Daisy Edgar Jones and sort of matching them together? I don't know if there was ever even a chemistry read.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that was a really exciting process to be sort of gifted this job. And so the journey began with a kind of a parallel search for both Marianne and Connell. And as Paul rightly said, we met Paul very early on, and we found our Connell sort of collectively very, very early on. So that was actually really exciting, because it meant that we had him. So now we were searching for her, and I've said a few times that the sort of talent which we kind of saw and the people we saw, I mean, the talent was just in abundance. It was amazing. And it was just about being sort of doggedly determined enough to keep going until we found the right person for Marianne. And then, as you quite rightly pointed out, so we met Daisy a little bit later. And then, yes, it was absolutely paramount we put them together, for sure. So we read a few people together with Paul, and the way I tell it is, they came in, and, the producers and Lenny and Karen were there, and we sort of formally, asked them to leave after they had done a number of scenes. And then there was just this kind of collective kind of light in the room when they left. We were so excited. So yes, it was a process, and absolutely the end had to be where we put them together and hoped for the magic, which we then found.
I mean, that's what's so strange about chemistry is you really never know. And the chemistry between Paul and Daisy is so wonderful, and the show hinges so much on it. I know it was there in the room, but can you and Paul and Lenny kind of talk about, did that develop once you got on sets? Because in a way, the characters are getting to know each other at the same time Paul and Daisy are, I assume.
Do you know what? It's actually interesting, because that is how I describe it. Like, my job is at the very early stages of the process, and that day was a really exciting thing, but there's no world in which, like, I just kind of, we have a little door which we kind of bring them through, and then of course the work starts, doesn't it? Do you know what I mean? So then, yeah.
Right from the beginning, as Alice says Sally and Alice herself as this incredible team adapting the novel. And then Daisy and Paul, they also just really liked each other in this really sort of fundamental and lovely way. And that kind of like proper friendship and care for the other and sense of humor shared, and like that's such an amazing thing to have at the center of a long and very difficult production, you know. And I think in a lovely way it just got better. I mean, that looked after itself. They became, and Paul will be much better on this than I am, but they became very good friends. And then I think we had a reasonably decent rehearsal phase, which meant that we were able to sort of, you know, as Paul and Daisy got to know each other, we were working on different parts of the story and getting, you know, moving towards the kind of, you know, through that phase of getting close to each other as the two of them became more and more, you know, connected to each other in real life. So, you know, it was such a lovely organic thing. There was no kind of, how do we create circumstances which will allow these actors to form the correct bond? You know, we didn't have to do that. We just all worked together in a lovely collective way, and that friendship seemed to deepen. But I think Paul will be able to speak to that better than I can.
You know, it's funny because over the weekend, myself and Daisy were sent the tape from the chemistry read, and like I feel like I'm looking at two like childlike versions of me and Daisy. But ultimately, when I was watching it, I was like, I just found the whole thing bizarre that I was looking at the reason why Lenny, Louise, and everybody chose myself and Daisy for Conal and Marianne, and there was nothing. It didn't feel like there was anything extraordinary about the acting, but it felt like we were totally in connection with each other in terms of how the two characters were speaking. And then when you fast forward to where we got to in the shoot in terms of how close me and Daisy got, and how great, how terrific we are as friends with each other, it just feels totally all encompassing to then go back to the first kind of 20 minutes that we saw each other. But in terms of, as Lenny said, we never felt like we had to like do any kind of exercises in terms of like developing chemistry, because I don't think that that's something that A, is possible, but B, is useful in a situation like that. We just got to spend a huge amount of time with each other, and luckily we liked each other as well.
I mean, you guys were really thrown into the fire, so to speak, because, you know, from very early on, you were sharing these incredibly intimate scenes. And I don't just mean physically, like emotionally. I feel you guys are exposing so much of yourselves.
Those scenes just require total trust between your scene partner, and then the environment that Lenny and the scripts created on set really allow that to breathe, and you feel safe within it. But I totally understand from an outsider's perspective that it feels like a really intense thing to do, but ultimately it was a really creative and free time on set.
I'm curious for each of you, what was the most challenging part of making the series? Like, when you're adapting it, like the most challenging scene to write or the most challenging role to cast, and then when you're on sets, you know, the scene that I don't want to say gave you the most trouble, but maybe you see it's on the call sheet for the next day, and that's the day that you're kind of a little bit nervous. And we can start with Alice.
I mean, I think in a kind of general way, it was certainly, you know, the book allows so much of their interior monologue, and so, you know, how are we going to do that without being expositional or, you know, making these characters speak in a way that feels false. I would say also probably like the first scene and the last scene, like in a, you know, that those were the ones that I feel like went through lots of drafts. Like when you've got, you know, the material is so good and you've got momentum and you're sort of writing episodes all back to back, then there was a kind of rhythm. But honoring that relationship and sort of allowing all of the complexity that's in the book to sit in those two scenes, particularly the last ones, you know, you sort of want to make sure that we're leaving them at exactly the right moment. That gave me some anxiety.
How many drafts do you estimate you went through, or can you even tell because you're doing, you know, all these different episodes? I don't know if there was one episode in particular you spent the most time on.
I mean, I think certainly maybe the later episodes, Lenny, do you think? I think probably episodes kind of 9, where Marianne's in Sweden, that was very difficult because suddenly she's in a really different environment, and also the two of them aren't together in the same physical space, and that felt really hard, but very necessary to see them without one another and to kind of understand their relationship. And then the last episode, I think, but in terms of how many drafts, I don't know.
Hard to remember.
You're going to raise that from my memory.
And Louise, for you, I mean, I was happy to hear you say that you had a lot of talent to choose from, but was there one role that gave you a particular challenge?
I wouldn't say there was one role, Jenelle. I think what was really important for us was that the cast surrounding Daisy and Paul, A, were hugely talented, which of course they were, but B, made a really strong impact in the story because, of course, again, in the book, they're so memorable. Her Trinity friends and Sligo pals, and like they're so memorable, and I like they give me so much joy when I watch the TV series. So I think it was much more to do with not one sort of challenge necessarily, but just making sure that we took every character and kind of curated the person, the casting of it correctly, so that the overall world is sort of detailed as regards kind of actors who embody the characters. That was our challenge. So I mean, it was, it took a long time, but it was worth it.
Paul, what about for you?
I suppose there was lots of moments on a shoot that's long that were difficult, but lots of them for very different reasons. I think one that jumps into my head, Lenny, is the scene when Connell is talking to Niall about not being able to stay in Marianne's house. And I remember, Lenny, we rehearsed that before lunch, and it all felt like, yeah, we know the shape of the scene. And then suddenly when we started shooting it, I can't remember what it was, but I remember that was early on enough in the shoot. And it was kind of the first time that I felt that, like, oh, it's not happening. I'm not getting the scene. And I remember the time and the patience that Lenny took with it was kind of extraordinary. But that was one of the moments that I felt the kind of the pressure of just not feeling like you're connected to it. And then other scenes, like there's different difficulties. Like sometimes you don't have a lot of time to shoot a scene, or say, for example, on that the phone call scene that we just saw there was an issue with the street lighting that was supposed to be turned off. That was hell. That was hell. So you're kind of going through a scene like that, which is emotionally quite difficult, but there's lots of moving parts that you kind of have to be dexterous and adapt as quickly as you can. But that they're kind of a couple to choose from.
Connell goes through so much, and especially in the later episodes, it's just heartbreaking to watch some of the things he's struggling with. Are you the kind of actor who can leave that at the door at the end of the day when you go home, or do you, does it affect you?
I don't work with the kind of in the method or as, so I do. I'm generally able to leave it at the door, and I think for me that's important because I think you're going in the next day and you could be shooting a scene that's tonally completely different, but there were certain like the scene with the therapist in particular, like that probably stayed a little bit longer or than I've ever felt before with other characters. But generally, I think I'm.
And Lenny, for you, what were some of the bigger challenges?
I mean, I think one of the things is that the story's quite, in a way, low key. For a TV drama, like it's small. The canvas is small in a way, but it still has to have, and hopefully it does. And I think have that sort of power. And one of the temptations maybe is to sort of overplay it, not as an actor, but as a director, particularly early on, because there's this fear that people won't stay with it if it's too quiet, or if you slide into it rather than announce it. And I think it was just calibrating the kind of temperature, particularly early on, so that it would capture the audience, but in a way which felt like they were observing rather than being sort of told that this is something super sexy and big and glossy or whatever. I think that was tricky. The other thing, and it relates to the scene that Paul mentions, like there is this sense in the novel, and it's very subtle, but it's very important that it's not just some kind of awkwardness or shyness or self-consciousness about class that's holding Connell back from, for example, asking Marianne, can he stay with her for the summer? And there's a whole series of a sequence leading up to that place where he can't ask her, the end of episode 6. And, you know, and actually that scene with Niall that you mentioned is part of that journey, which is Niall says, why won't you ask her? And there's a moment in that, I think we discovered it when we were doing it, which is he can't answer that question for himself at that moment. That was the key to that scene.
Totally, yeah.
And I think that, like, we try to discover things as we go, and like in the whole conversation, say with Alice and Sally as well, constantly moving back from rehearsal back to Alice and discussing what we thought we discovered, or where there were kind of other spaces to be explored, and trying to continue to do that on set, and all the time keep it sort of feeling like you're not giving an audience a pre-digested series of thoughts or story, but you're allowing them to watch it unfold. Those were the challenges, I think, most that I mostly remember.
You know, I think most limited series, especially ones with 12 episodes, tend to split up the episodes between several directors and also several writers. What was it like to, decide to do the first 6 episodes and then, turn it over to another director? And Alice, for you, taking on pretty much, the bulk of the writing work. I'm sort of curious, is that refreshing, or is it intimidating, or maybe both?
I mean, yeah, I think probably a bit of both, but mostly, actually, no. I really loved it. I think Marco Rowe wrote episode 11 and did the most beautiful job, and I felt really envious that I couldn't like have that as well. I felt quite greedy about it. I think it was such a privilege to be able to kind of see it almost the whole way through, and to really invest in the characters, and to sort of feel confident about being able to write characters that Sally had made. So daunting, yes, but mostly I absolutely loved it. I felt very lucky.
And Lenny, what was it like to pass the baton to another director?
Well, we were very lucky to have Hayley MacDonald, who's an amazing director and very much has her own vision. And I think what we decided early on, I did toy with the idea, because I also felt very greedy about it. I toyed with the idea of doing the whole thing, but I think it just would have been very hard to deliver it on time for a start. And I think the other thing I knew was that I think we all felt that the story itself does kind of naturally fall into 2 halves. I mean, you mentioned that very often you'd have 3 or 4 directors on or even 6, even 2 per, on a show like this. But we felt like it should be, you could make sense of it creatively as falling into 2 parts with a sort of tonal shift in the middle. And we thought that it would be kind of in keeping with the essence of the thing to allow another sensibility into that second phase. I think Hetty did an amazing job, and she also, we were still all involved, and so it didn't feel like I was completely sort of letting it go. But I can't say it was also completely comfortable for me. It's very hard to say, at the end of the first block, it was really hard for me to sort of say goodbye to everybody and the crew, and particularly Daisy and Paul, and hand over to somebody else. But I think the results are wonderful. So, that's the only thing that matters.
We have a couple audience questions. There's a lot of people who want to know, why do you think people all over the world have responded so strongly to this show? I mean, even, in America, we have different discussions about class, but we can, who can't relate to Young Love? I'm just curious if any of you have any opinions as to why it has such universal appeal.
I personally, I feel, well, my initial response to the book when I read it is that I recognized both of those characters straight away from the first 3 or 4 pages. And I think that the trick is with that is that Sally has manufactured a way in which those characters stay interesting from the first page to the last, but stay recognizable. And I think they are deeply extraordinary people, but in really recognizable circumstances. And I think that's why people have responded to it the way they have.
Paul, I know you're on social media, so you must see the rhapsodic responses to the show.
Yeah, it's pretty, it was pretty, when it dropped on BBC, that weekend was pretty extraordinary. That weekend of kind of seeing tweets and people respond to it, it's pretty vast.
I mean, it's a love story, and it's a story that might often, because it's about young people, or people, young adults. You might think in Lesser Hands Than Sally's, and then in Alice's and Sally's, that it could easily be just for that demographic. But I think what's great about the material, and I'm glad to see that it worked for the show, is that it's something which, whether you're going through it now or whether it's tinged with a kind of nostalgia for what you experienced before, it's a very, very universal experience to fall in love and be, the kind of enormity of that, even in the smallness of an ordinary life, is something that the book really honors, and I think something that people of all cultures can recognize, and perhaps that explains something about the reaction.
People want to know about a season 2. Is there any possibility? Would you be open to it? Even if not right away, maybe sometime in the future?
I should answer that one.
Yeah, Lenny, you take that one, Lenny.
Okay, just let me consult my manual. I like we always said at the beginning, that we would do the novel because that's, there's a natural shape to it. I mean, there's a satisfying shape to the novel. Sally chose to end it where she did for, I think, really valid reasons. But it is an open ending as well, so there is that kind of immediately that question. There are no immediate plans for a season 2, and I don't think anybody is interested within our group of just continuing the story from where it left off. But we have a kind of fantasy that maybe in 5 years' time or whatever, if everybody still wants to do it, like, it would be fascinating to see what had happened to those two characters because they're such well kind of drawn and real people. I'd like to know where they might be in that number of years, but no concrete plans.
I'm going to take that as a definite yes. It's funny because I have my own fan fiction in my brain about where these two characters go, and I think about it. So I'll check in with you in 5 years. In the meantime, I want to thank Hulu, and special thanks to Lenny, Paul, Alice, and Louise for chatting with us today, and to everyone who is watching or listening to our panel from your couch, office, or wherever you are right now. Thank you so much for joining us.